today. He is a motivational mental health speaker. Today we are focusing on imposter syndrome. Listen up, because we want to bust the stigma. We want to help leaders like you spot it, not only in yourself, but also in team members and colleagues. And really, we want to help you distinguish between natural healthy levels of imposter syndrome and what can be done, and really debilitating levels, and then some of the support options you might need. Welcome, Andrew. Before we kick into all of that, do you want to just introduce yourself and what you do in a little bit more?
Men just need to talk about that there are barriers that prevent men from talking easily. So there's a whole bunch of stuff there. But alongside that, I talk about also a number of well-being topics that relate very closely to leadership. Burnout, imposter syndrome is very busy as a topic for me. Mastery of time, decision making. So this is all the stuff that I sort of have separate keynote talks for, working with schools, colleges, unis, big organisations, NHS trust councils, and the like. And then I'm also a dad. Very busy dad. I've got 3 boys under 11. And I often say, that makes me a bribery guru, a blackmailing expert, a maid, a tutor, a cook, a taxi driver, and just about everything else.
Excellent. And a good juggler by the sound of it.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that, actually. Someone that aspires to juggle but fails miserably probably is better said.
Okay, whole myriad there. Yeah. So let's focus in on imposter syndrome today. I guess for those that experience it, it's quite common to feel quite alone, isn't it? But just how common is it, imposter syndrome?
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, first of all, with imposter syndrome, yes, it's a lack of confidence in your abilities. But the thing that sort of makes it imposter syndrome, if you look at the definition, is this fear of exposure, that you're about to be exposed as an inadequate fraud, that somehow you've blagged your way into the position that you're in. You don't know what you're doing. You're the only one that doesn't know what you're doing. Everyone else knows what they're doing, and you are about to be exposed. Any achievements that you have, you didn't deserve them, by luck rather than judgment. And it's a horrible feeling. And imposter syndrome, if you punch into Google, how many people struggle with this strange thing called imposter syndrome? Generally, the figure will be 70%. That's generally the figure that will come back at you. And there are some people that really struggle with it being called imposter syndrome. There are some clinicians, psychologists that will say it's not a syndrome. But when it was first coined as a phrase in the 1970s, it was actually known as one of 3 things: imposter phenomenon, imposter experience, and imposter syndrome. And probably imposter phenomenon and imposter experience would be better names for it. But the one that's stuck is imposter syndrome. That's what we...
Whatever it's called, people feel it, don't they?
Yeah, they feel it. And it's probably always been with us, although it wasn't properly recognised as a thing until the 1970s. Even Albert Einstein referred to himself as an involuntary swindler. Could never understand why everyone was so interested in his work. But where I think there's confusion is some people would say, but it keeps you on your toes. It's a mark of self-awareness. It's a mark of humility. It's a good thing. But then Bradley Wiggins smashed up many of his trophies due to imposter syndrome entirely. Now, that doesn't sound like a good thing to me. That doesn't sound terribly healthy. So... yeah, so there's 2 versions of it. That's what I would say.
I guess on everything there's a spectrum, isn't there? From, I guess, if you had none of this type of feeling, then you might be really ego-led and not care about anyone else at one end of the spectrum. Right.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Completely debilitating because you can't move because you feel so bad about yourself.
Yeah. Well, the way I break it down, I've done some research around this, from delivering workshops on it, working one-to-one with people that struggle with imposter syndrome, I noticed there were like 2 expressions. The first I refer to as a mild expression, where a mild imposter syndrome is it's temporary. It comes and it goes. It's not with you the whole time. It's generally if you're in a new role, you've got a particularly big presentation. Last year, I delivered my burnout talk. It's a talk I know inside out, back to front, standing on my head, but I was delivering it to 60 senior GPs, and I had a particular wobble because I felt like, well, each of those GPs is better qualified than me to deliver this talk. I wouldn't normally have a wobble delivering that talk, but I did in it. So I struggle with it, but it's temporary. And anybody listening to this that has this mild version, you're probably thinking, well, if I can pick up a few tips when it hits me on the head, like when I've got a big presentation, that might be quite useful, but I can't say it ruins my life. But then the other version, the severe version, is how I refer to it, is it's permanent. It batters you every day. This sense of utter inadequacy about to be found out. It prevents you from doing things that you would otherwise do. It leads to bitter self-loathing, regret. And according to the research that I've done of sort of 5,000 UK working employees, roughly 70% of people say they struggle with the more mild version of it. 15% say they struggle with the severe version. 15% people say they don't struggle with it at all, except for in the NHS, where 75% of people say they struggle with it mild. 25% of people say they struggle with it on a severe level, and nobody says they don't struggle with it at all in the NHS. Possibly because the stakes are so high. You make a mistake if I deliver a poor talk, that's bad news for the client. They probably won't book me again. Everyone goes home. It's a regrettable loss of an hour, but no one died. Whereas in the NHS, I think the stakes are higher. They are expected to know their stuff. They feel like they should have answers. We think they should have all the answers, and this creates that extra pressure. So my view would be, as leaders, how can we manage imposter syndrome so it is more of this mild thing? How can we bring it down to severe if it's at a severe level? And also, even if we struggle with it on a mild level, what are the things that we can do in those moments where we do struggle with it, when it comes and goes, just to make sure that we're at our best? And that's the point of thinking about strategies to tackle imposter syndrome.
Okay, great. So let's explore those different levels. So if somebody has it at a mild level, and I'm a leader and they're within my team, how do I spot it? How do I notice it? Is the questions I need to ask them to help identify it? What do I do as a leader to help somebody who might have it at the mild level?
Yeah, and I think at a mild level, you'll know it because they'll be scared of doing, and you'll be scared of it, not because you think you're going to die and kill yourself, just you'll be scared because you'll think it's possibly beyond you. It could go horribly wrong. And if it does, what will people think of you? Can I genuinely step up? And you have some sense of lack of confidence. But there'll be a specific thing that you'll be able to identify that's giving you that wobble. You've joined a new team. There's a new project that's come in that sort of falls outside your skill set. Maybe a people problem has erupted at work and you don't feel cut out adequately skilled to deal with that, but all eyes are on you to deal with that. And so it's where something new has suddenly come onto your plate, and you're not walking away from it, but looking at it, it is giving you a major wobble because you don't think you're cut out for it. And within that circumstance, what I would say as well with people that struggle with it on a mild level is generally they find it easier to talk about than those that struggle with it on severe level, where often they're very embarrassed that it's become such a problem. Okay. So if you recognize that you're in that position where you're doubting your qualities to deal with this situation that you have, then there are self-management tools. So for example, the things that I do when I'm getting a particular wobble, and can I handle this? Am I going to be exposed? For me as a speaker, that can happen where, let's say I'm on stage, there's several hundred people there, they're uber successful. So I remind myself of certain truths about the way the world works. You see, some people would say, well, I remind myself of my skills and strengths, and that's great. I can remind myself of my skills and strengths on a good day when I'm not feeling the wobble. But when I'm feeling the wobble, for me, if I remind myself of my skills and strength, I have an internal barrister that will just unpick it all and tell me why actually I am going to fail at this thing. So I need something more than my own skills and strength. And what works for me are grounded truths about the way the world works that my barrister cannot unpick. Truths like, behind every person, uber successful person's smile, there is pain, there is suffering, there are unrealized goals, there's worry about their health, their kids' health, or whatever it may be. We all carry that pain and fear. So however well qualified they are, and however well qualified I'm not in comparison with them, I can connect with them on a human level because we have these root things that connect us as humans. I remind myself of that very deliberate and a very intentional way in that situation. I remind myself of truths like, although we value a PhD, and we should do, someone that's achieved a PhD is remarkable, the amount of self-discipline, self-study. I have huge respect for someone, and they'll be a doctor and they might mention their PhD on their CV and LinkedIn profile. They probably will. But actually, in terms of developing wisdom in a person, the person that's been through the bitter divorce, dragged through the family courts, been through a horrendous time, come out the other side, that experience is just as important as developing wisdom and insight in a person. But we probably won't wear that on our sleeve, will we? We probably won't have on our LinkedIn profile, wise due to divorce and family court battle, will we? We're not going to say that on our CV. But I remind myself that actually each of our journeys, whatever it looks like in terms of materialistic success, is hugely valid in developing wisdom and insight. So I start to remind myself of some of these truths like actually 70% of people struggle with imposter syndrome. So if I'm feeling scared in this situation, it just makes me normal, actually. And I know we should all want to be a maverick, and I do in certain situations in my life, but when I quite like being normal when it comes to imposter syndrome. So I remind myself of that percentage.
I guess what you've described there for the mild version is, if I understand it correctly, just that conversation with your inner voice, your inner chimp, or whatever you want to call it, to present some, I guess, some factual stuff versus the feelings. Is it
yeah, it's not, and that's where people that have medical training, whether they're a GP or a psychologist, that's where the issue over this word syndrome is sort of misleading. I mean, you could argue it could lead to a medical condition, couldn't you? If you have severe imposter syndrome that then triggers real sort of crippling depression. And let's be clear on some of the causes of imposter syndrome. So it's not just stepping out of your comfort zones to do something new, although that can trigger it. I worked with someone where actually it was the university choice that she'd made in comparison with siblings. And she was happy with that, as were her siblings. But then later on, family, friends were making disparaging comments about her decision. So it started this train of thought. She'd let her parents down. She'd let herself down. She can't trust her own decision making. This is a highly talented woman in a high level role, but absolutely debilitated by imposter syndrome, but linked back to that one thing. So there are things that have happened to us, decisions that we've made that for us as an individual feel very traumatic. I work with a guy where his imposter syndrome that was affecting him at work now, this feeling of inadequacy. He never used to feel inadequate. He had a very working class background. He married a woman from a very upper class background. Family were lovely. There's no issue with that. But he felt so out of his depth. It started this habit of feeling out of his depth. So there's things like being in the cultural minority within a workplace, or the gender minority. You might be a male primary school teacher. Only 15% primary school teachers are male. So you particularly feel like all eyes are on you. The spotlight is on you. So that can trigger imposter syndrome. Social media has exacerbated the issue, in my opinion, because never before have we been exposed to everyone else's good bits in quite the same way that we are today.
We're all perfect, aren't we, on social media? Everyone is.
Yeah, and I remind myself again, in terms of what is true, we know that what is true in social media is people share their best bits, their exaggerated bits, or their fake bits. Now, I trust people, so I like to think it's just their best bits. But in which case, we shouldn't be surprised that we're looking over our shoulder, comparing ourselves unfavorably with other people, given what we expose ourselves to. So social media has a role to play as well in imposter syndrome. But the list, so go on, yeah.
It's a bit like a swan in a way. That's how I visualize it. Because you've got the beautiful swan, that's your representation on social media, but there's probably some paddling of feet underneath that represents kind of all the stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, and I'm the same. So on LinkedIn, I'll post if I've done a particularly good event, there's some particularly good feedback, it's a particularly juicy client, I'll probably stick it on LinkedIn, won't I? If I'm having a day at home, I've had no calls and no inquiries for the last week, I'm bored and I'm feeling depressed. Am I, as a speaker, going to say bored and depressed, I've had no inquiries? I'm not going to say that. Of course I'm not. And neither's any other speaker, but we all have weeks like that. So I think, sorry?
Give it a try, Andrew. I dare you, give it a try.
I probably
You'll
will.
get more likes.
Yeah, yeah,
The
yeah. And you
algorithm will
also get
love it.
more likes, I've noticed on LinkedIn, if you swear profusely, because then people think, they're being so real. It's like, they're not being real. They just put some swear words in to get more likes. But yeah, I digress. But I mean, I think the other thing with imposter
Sorry.
syndrome is if we think that over thousands of years, our survival has depended on belonging to a group, being respected by that group, we shouldn't be surprised, therefore, that we have this kind of deep seated fear of the opposite of that, of not belonging, of not being accepted. So, again, when you start to look at the list of reasons why people struggle, results driven environments where the pressure is on, you feel like you cannot make a mistake, has been known to exacerbate. So someone that never really struggled with it before, let's say they've got a very demanding boss, they're in an environment where they cannot make a mistake, the pressure is on, then again that can start these feelings of I'm out my depth, I can't cope. They're not talking about it because they're ashamed of it, so then the problem becomes bigger and bigger. And so I think in terms of how you deal with it and looking out for your team, that's where this big crucial word that many people in the wellbeing sector know, and you'll probably be familiar with it, but it's amazing how many people don't know what it means. And that's where psychological safety starts to come into its own. Because if you want people to talk about it openly, particularly people that struggle with it on a more severe level, there has to be psychological safety, or they won't.
And I believe that's I think I read somewhere that's the number one factor in terms
Yeah,
of
well,
sort of
Google,
team.
yeah, Google launched a Project Aristotle, to get to the question of what's the magic ingredient behind. Is there even a magic ingredient behind the best performing teams? And of course, they found, with an open mind going into this, that there was, and it was psychological safety, which, of course, as you and I know, is where you feel utterly safe to be transparent. You make a mistake, you could get away with it. You probably still say something, because what if someone else makes that mistake? You wouldn't hide it. Things that you're struggling with, disagreeing with decisions made, concerns about things. Maybe your team are cutting corners. You just say, guys, we're cutting corners here. We can't do this. You'd feel totally fine about that because you're psychologically safe. And as leaders, we have to think about practically how we create it, because it's one thing to know about it and know what it means. It's quite another to think about practically, how would I deliver that on a day-to-day basis, week-to-week basis when we're under pressure? How do I create that environment? And there are small things that leaders can do if you want to know where to get started. So I don't know if you've heard, but so one organization that I work with, they do have cake and mistake meetings on a monthly basis where they meet for cake. And the purpose of the meeting is to discuss a mistake that was made in the previous month. If you didn't make a mistake in the previous month, then you have to try and think back to where you might well have made a mistake actually, or came close to it. And the idea is that leaders themselves share the mistakes they've made. The point being to identify problems early, but also to signal that it's okay to make a mistake, and share that. And if you did something really daft, yeah, it's so simple.
I love that.
Yeah, but if you deliver that on a monthly basis, you tend to find at first, if you imagine how that would play out in reality, that at first it's a bit stilted, feels a bit forced, but then people start to get into the rhythm of it, and it becomes natural, normal part of conversation, and then you can build more from there. There are some groups that would say, well, I really want to experiment with, rather than saying, how are you? I'm fine. Yeah, not bad. That's the usual thing. Let's, as a team, really try to give ourselves a mark out of 10 and explain why we feel that way. Maybe we'll just do that once a week. If that was every day, that'd be a bit onerous. So let's start there. There's different things that you could do, really easy, that cost no money, just to start the process, or even build on the process of being psychologically safe. Maybe your team, when you look at it, actually, yeah, there is psychological safety here, but to continue reinforcing that, there are little things that leaders can do. And there's a lot. The list goes on. We'd be here a long time going through them all. Yeah,
absolutely. That's probably another session, isn't it? I'll invite you back for that one, Andrew. But just on this, so imposter, I know that's what we're focusing on today, but it's almost forgetting the term, particularly for the mild. We'll come back to the more severe, but for the mild term, that's just people being people, isn't it? We all feel anxious about certain things. We all worry about certain things. So is it okay as a leader to not label it at that stage. As long as we're encouraging open conversation and supporting people through how they feel, then do we really need that term on a
I think
level?
it's helpful to have the term. I think the term is here. The term is with us. It's a trending term. So I think it's useful as a leader to know what it is. I think it's useful as a leader to know that if you think about the term, this fear of being exposed, sense of inadequacy, you're not cut out for what you've got, what you have on your plate to deal with. It's all going to come crashing down. You don't deserve to be where you are. I think to know that there is a term that describes it, that some people in your team feel that just from time to time, but some people in your team, you may not, this isn't easy to spot because they might not talk about it, really struggle in quite a severe way with that. Some of that might be the people you would suspect, people that they're not putting themselves forward. They appear like they have certain levels of anxiety. Sometimes it's people that are just so conscientious and thoughtful, but then of course, people that are very thoughtful, the ones that always remember everyone's birthdays, they're also the type then, because remember, every strength is also a curse, be the type to overthink things. And if you're an overthinker, then you really might struggle with imposter syndrome. Those that don't overthink things, you might not remember people's birthdays very easily, but you're probably not going to overthink imposter syndrome either. So I think it is useful to have that term, to just have that open as a conversation, to be open as a leader to where you felt inadequate. That helps other people to say, hey, do you know, I felt that. And that then starts a conversation of, well, how do we help? How do we share? What are the tips? Like I say, for me, grounded truths are so important. Another grounded truth is actually you can't be an imposter if you don't lie to anybody, if you don't willfully mislead. So look at the Oxford Dictionary definition of the term imposter. So my view, and I've reminded myself of this several times where I've felt I'm out. Usually for me, it is when I say on stage, I'm not sort of beefing myself up here, but when I'm on stage, if I'm feeling that wobble, which occasionally I do, again, I remind myself, look, I haven't lied to anyone. I've been very clear in my marketing, who I am, what I deliver. I've had my pre-session call with the booking client, been very clear about what I'm delivering, and they've still picked me. So I do belong here. I do belong. Yeah. I'm not an imposter. And so I check, if you look at my marketing, I don't make any ridiculous claims. Part of that is so that I know when I'm experiencing that wobble, I know absolutely 100% I've not exaggerated. I deserve to be there. So these are some of the truths that almost like I've got like a toolbox of grounded truths that are there, and I sort of go through them one by one, and it just helps steady me when I'm in that moment of concern.
You were talking earlier on about certain times it's triggered by certain things. You might have a big presentation, and I guess that's easier for a leader to see, I don't know, one of their team members ahead of a big presentation, that they're being affected or feeling differently, and probably ask them some questions to help them. Certain times it's kind of latent almost, more subconscious, if you like. So how as a leader do you tap into understanding that?
It's hard. And also, I'm just going to add to this. I don't mean to digress, but cliques are a nasty trigger for imposter syndrome, where you felt like you were fine and now you feel like you're on the outside. You feel like you don't belong. But if you're in a situation where there's a clique and you're not part of it, and you're spending a lot of time in that situation on the outside of a clique, it's amazing how much you start to doubt yourself. Am I likable? But cliques are so hard to spot when you're in them. You can't spot a clique. No one's cliquing. What would you mean? Yeah. But outside of a clique, it's really easy to spot them. And so understanding how cliques work. And the other thing I would say, people that form cliques, they're not bad people. They don't want to exclude people. It's not a deliberate thing. It's just easier to talk to people you already know. Yeah. It's easier to be a social creature of habit. We kid ourselves that we haven't got time to make new friendships. We're struggling to keep up with the friends that we do have. And so again, as a leader, being really real about cliques, talking about cliques in an environment where there's psychological safety, you may have people, if there's psychological safety, that would say, actually, I do feel it's a bit cliquey here for these reasons. But without psychological safety, none of that conversation will be had. So for me, in terms of spotting some of the harder to spot triggers of imposter syndrome, you're more likely to spot it if genuinely there is psychological safety, absolutely a foundation. It's one of those, like, I'm really careful in my talks to not duplicate content in case you book several of my talks. But psychological safety is one of those topics that really, comes up in virtually every talk. It has to. It's so important.
Yeah, because there's an overlap with so many of these things. We often say, well, what's the, I'm often asked about motivation and what's the number one thing you can do to motivate people. And my response is generally, well, get to know them on a one-to-one level if your team allows that. Because if you're doing that, then that would allow you to have conversations that potentially unearth how people feel and if they suffer from imposter syndrome at any 100%. Level. Wouldn't it? And how about let's look now at the more debilitating side to it. How do we spot that? How do we help people?
Well,
one
of the ways to create psychological safety is being vulnerable and open yourself as a leader and setting the tone. And that's why I was saying it's helpful in a way to have the term as leaders to just be talking openly about it, to be able to share, actually, I've really struggled with this for these reasons. That kind of vulnerability and sort of openness is really important. It sends a very clear signal to those with severe imposter syndrome that they're not alone. It's not weird. It's not embarrassing. Look, my leader's talking about it. So that, that's a really good starting point. I think it's also useful with people that struggle with it on a severe level is, whereas with someone that struggles with it on a mild level, just some helpful tips, bit of support in that one-off moment where they're feeling the wobble, that's fine. That's going to be really helpful. Someone that struggles with it on a more severe level, you've got a much longer term piece of work to do in supporting them. It's going to be, if it's become severe, it's probably become a bit of a habit. So your work with them is going to need to be gentle, long term. The reassuring, it's not about just reassuring as a one-off. It's going to be a much longer term thing of working alongside them, having those regular conversations, the regular checking in that you probably wouldn't need with someone if they were struggling with it on a mild level, because it's coming and going fairly infrequently. The last time I had a major wobble, probably a couple of months ago. I don't know when the next one will come, but and when I say a major wobble, it was like a couple of days just sort of feeling edgy and just reminding myself of what I know to be true, and that was fine. But for people with severe imposter syndrome, understanding that there may also be wider issues around overthinking, anxiety in particular. I've had the question, and I haven't done and I don't feel there's enough research done in terms of the link of neurodiversity and imposter syndrome. But that's a whole other area where I think more research is needed. If you are neurodiverse, does that make it more likely that you would struggle with a more severe version of imposter syndrome or not? That's not a question that I could answer right now, but one that's probably worth some research.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess the fact that it affects so many people, up to 70% at a mild level, as you mentioned earlier, I guess it's more common
absolutely
than not.
Yeah.
That's quite reassuring in itself, isn't it? It's like, well, you're almost in a minority.
And I think what we have found, there has been the point, it depends which newspaper you read in terms of their political leaning. There has been an argument that it affects women more than men. I don't see that. And I think initially when it was coined as a phrase, the early samples that were taken, the early research was all on women. The first researchers to put the phrase out there, Dr. Pauline Rose Clance, Suzanne Imes. But then as the work's been duplicated and more people have jumped on the back and said, we'll research in our city, country, culture, it's fairly even. And so you could argue, well, women, of course, have been disadvantaged in so many ways over the centuries. So is there a particular challenge there? But it's not something that I've seen. I've seen really, it's regardless of culture, class, gender, it does affect literally 70 to 85% of people, male, female people.
I think that you say that, because I was mentioning I was doing this talk to someone the other day and goes, that affects women more, doesn't it? And I said, well, I'm not sure. And it, is it that just do they Are they more open about it? Do they talk about it more? Are there any reasons why people
I
might
think
believe that myth?
so. I've also heard the phrase as well that sort of ethnic minorities feel it more. I think particularly where women have been in situations where they've been very much the minority, or a female in a STEM related job, for example. If you're in a minority anywhere, you're going to feel particularly like the spotlight is on you. Do I truly belong? Are they truly accepting of me? Like I say, you could be a nurse, a male nursery worker. I think it's less than 4% of nursery workers are in fact male. So I think being in a minority of sorts, whatever that situation is could trigger this sense of belonging, or do I not belong, and that extra.
That makes logical sense, doesn't it? Because you are different to some degree, and I guess you've got to be more confident for that to not
Yeah, I
have
felt
any
so. I
effect
mean,
on how
I've been fortunate that I've been able to share the parenting of our boys with my wife, a wonderful woman. She works for the NHS. But I know at some of the stay and play groups that I went to, I literally was the only man there. And I really felt this sense of outside and not belonging. The women were friendly enough; they'd say hello, but whereas they'd all been deep in conversation, I was always on. I mean, I was there with my boy, and it was fine. He had a nice time, but there was no real welcome and friendliness. So I started to feel like I don't really belong here. So for me, it's where the minority thing is probably the cause of that.
Yeah, it's an interesting way of looking, because it's almost that as a leader, you could look at it and say, well, ask yourself the question is, well, how do I make sure that everyone feels like they belong here? Is an easier question to ask because there's not really any stigma attached to it.
Yeah, and I
But
think
probably get you a good
consistency
result.
is important as well. I think we're all human, so we know that halo effect. For example, let's say you've got mates, you get on really well with someone, you've worked with them for years, you trust them, they trust you, so you are more likely to back their ideas more quickly and with less scrutiny than you would someone that you don't really know that well. But then the person that you don't know that well could be at a similar level, maybe they're new to the team, but they see you backing someone else's idea more quickly with less scrutiny and less less suspicion, and yet they come with an idea and you're asking lots of questions about it. So I think as leaders, being aware of your biases and how your biases will shape your behavior is also really important. And it's amazing how many people I speak to who have been on an unconscious bias training course. So I asked them, well, there's over 180, so name me some then if you've been on this one-day training, and most of them can't even name one. So you think, well, either you weren't paying attention or there's a real problem with unconscious bias training. But I think as leaders, there are over 180 common human biases. You can't possibly know what they all are. But what we can do as leaders is say, well, what are the 15 to 20 most common ones that might affect my leadership decision making? And there are books, a couple of books on unconscious bias that I think are useful. Dave McCraney's written 2 books. You Are Now Less Dumb, You Are Not So Smart. They got sort of mixed reviews on Amazon because they're not deeply academic books, but they're quite useful for just saying, okay, yeah, these are kind of the most common 20. So how do I relate to these? Really take your time when you're reading that, but don't just read it in a hurry. Really think about where have these biases possibly tripped me up. Start getting comfy with the most common biases. And that has helped me, certainly. I'm not perfect. No one ever is. But for me, for example, sunk cost fallacy was one of my big problems because I'm naturally tenacious as a person. But because I'm naturally tenacious, I often hang in there well beyond the point that's sensible. But a lot of what's keeping me there is sunk cost fallacy is when I invest in something, I don't want to lose my investment, even if it's in a queue. If I've been in the queue 20 minutes, it makes no sense. I don't want to leave that queue. I've been in it for 20 minutes. Thanks very much. So being aware of your biases, though, in terms of imposter syndrome, halo effect, affinity bias, horn effect, these are all confirmation biases. These are all biases that as leaders we should be aware of, because these can create a sense of I'm not trusted, I'm on the outside, if you're on the receiving end of that. That makes sense.
Excellent. Yeah, some more research for me there. Definitely look into that in a bit more depth. And you've also got, for people who are feeling it, because it's not, I mean, leaders are going to feel it themselves. It's not just going to be prevalent within their teams. And I believe when I saw you speak before, you mentioned some great tools. I think one was called the Flame Pie tool.
Oh, okay. So yeah, that's where. So we know that negative words said to us in the past can be a trigger for imposter syndrome. Let's say you're nervous about a situation that you're facing, and then these words are coming back at you. Maybe it was a teacher, maybe it was a parent, a step parent, a family friend, a former boss. And I think it's really important if we think about imposter syndrome, that we actually also think about how we deal with negative feedback. Because some people would say, oh, don't worry about what everyone else thinks. Stop caring about what everyone else thinks. But we should care what other people think. But we need to be able to process what other people say to us, so that we can strip out the helpful stuff from the not so helpful stuff. As leaders, you're going to get negative feedback. Right. It's part of life. It's part of you. If ever it was difficult to please everyone, now that we live in the diverse society that we do, it's absolutely impossible to please everyone, which is a good thing. But the challenge with that is you are going to be receiving opinions, comments about you and your work that you're not going to welcome, but which could still be worth paying attention to. So how do you do that? So with blame pie, that's where you would draw a circle that, let's say you've had some negative feedback about let's say you were a marketer, you had a very important business pitch. The business pitch failed, and they also provided some feedback which basically said you screwed the pitch up because you're rubbish. So therefore, blame pie would be you draw a circle, you imagine that pie is the setback, and you understand that a piece of that pie you're going to have to take for yourself. So you draw a segment. What are the things that you screwed up on that you're going to take responsibility for? It's okay. What are the specifics? But then you have to share that pie out, because failure and success are both highly complex things with lots of things affecting them. So you force yourself to find other things that were also to blame. And you go around, it might be that your pie has 8 segments, it might be it has 4, but you absolutely make sure that you have a piece for yourself, and you have pieces that draw in external events, other people's contribution to that thing going on. Even if it was fairly tenuous, and then you look at that completed pie that you've drawn out, and you could do it on the back of a napkin. I love tools that are just really easy. You could just do in a pub on an envelope or something. And then you reflect and think about then your action points. It's just a really helpful way. I've also used something that's my tool called Setback Square, where it's like a similar thing, but it's in a square, and you have to have an answer for each of the 4 squares. Square 1 is what was my fault. Square 2 is what was their fault, other people. Square 3 is what was no one's fault, but I accept as an external thing. There might be learning from that square. And square 4 are my action points. What am I going to do, therefore, moving on from this point? But these are the kind of tools, one-to-one with people can work well if someone's screwed up on something, helping them. You could do the blame pie or setback square with them, or just for yourself on the back of a napkin or something. These are just ways of saying it's important that we process negative feedback. It's important if we trust the feedback, i.e. we trust the intentions of the person giving us the feedback, and we trust their quality and skills within this area, that they are well qualified to give us a piece of feedback. If we trust it, then we've got to process it in some way. The only feedback that I ignore completely is if I don't trust it, because either the agenda of the person means that I'm not going to trust it, or actually they mean well, but within this area, I don't feel they're well qualified. And that's up to you to make that decision, but to think clearly about that, and then work your way through a blame pile or setback square if you trust the feedback, is a really helpful way of saying, doing something with it and not being battered by it either.
Great tools. And I can almost see applications where you've got the right environment set already. You could do that with a team, couldn't you?
Absolutely. As a team
leader, you could do it and say, I know you led this, but literally 52% I take responsibility for, because I set you up for that task in the first place. It'd be a great tool used in the right way.
And some people say, blame pie's got negative connotations. No, absolutely. So it depends on the dynamic that you have. If you have good relationship with your team, there's psychological safety. You could all have a bit of a laugh about the word blame pie. If you really wanted to, you could just call it something different. You could call it responsibility, circle of progress, call it whatever you want. But I quite like blame pie. I think that works quite well.
Yeah, I think some people call it responsibility
It's a
pie.
bit of a mouthful, that. Just call it blame pie, but just have a laugh with people as well.
Blame pie.
Yeah.
It's far better with the cake example,
Yeah.
the cake meeting that you mentioned earlier as well. Thank you so much. There's loads of outtakes for people there. Is there anything else that you think is fundamental for a leader to know about imposter syndrome that is
No,
not
I
often
think
talked
summing
about?
up really, I think understanding that there are different versions, I think it's helpful to look at it. The sense of mild and severe, that's my expression, that's my interpretation of imposter syndrome. I don't know of anyone else that talks about it in that way, but it's fairly makes common sense, doesn't it? So understanding that for people that really, really struggle with it, they are going to find it harder to talk about, but that you can set the tone by being vulnerable yourself. I think some people, the only other myth I would say is there is a view, well, what about this 15% that don't struggle with it? Does that make them arrogant, delusional? I don't think it necessarily does. I think within that 15%, undoubtedly, there's going to be a percentage of people that are arrogant and delusional. I haven't asked that 15%, are you arrogant and delusional or just very self-aware? But I think within that 15%, there are going to be people that are just very comfortable in their own skin. They're not arrogant, or they're just very self-aware, self-assured. And I don't think that means that's unhealthy. That's the only other thing I would probably add into the mix.
And when you get, I guess, on a more severe level, I guess part of that equation can be to understand where your skill set is as a leader. I.e., and I've recognised this in myself on a number of occasions in terms of the things that I can actually do to help, and the times I need to go, hang on, this is a bit, I need to get external help for this person. Is there anywhere where would people go to work that out, or where would people go to get help for somebody that they think had severe version that they didn't think they could deal with just themselves?
I think if you're concerned about a colleague that has a really severe version of imposter syndrome, until they talk about it, you have to try and create an environment where they would feel at ease. And I don't want to keep coming back to psychological safety, but that team environment, if it's a highly competitive environment, if it's a team under huge pressure and there isn't that relational side between colleagues, if it's a team where unfortunately there are for cliques in particular, having those open conversations about how cliques form, it does really come back to that. If you're concerned that someone else might have severe imposter syndrome, but also bearing in mind that we're complicated as humans. So you're not going to know, like if you suspect someone else has severe imposter syndrome, it might just be they're just going through a really rubbish time in their life. And so they're exhibiting signs of extreme anxiety, overthinking, doubt, and so maybe they're always belittling themselves and their own achievements. And it might be that actually just asking if they're okay, and actually having a laugh with them. It depends on your link with them, but reminding them when they're belittling their own achievements, saying, no, actually, that is really good. And I do that. And then maybe trying to create, once you've created that connection, you've had a chat, maybe trying to create some humor about it as well. If that works, it depends on the person. But you're not always going to know that it is severe imposter syndrome, because like I say, sometimes people are just going through a bad time in their life. And so they get into a habit of belittling themselves and then get into a habit of negativity. It's not necessarily severe imposter syndrome at the same time.
Good, yeah. So the more you get to know those people.
Yeah. And everyone's got loads of time for that, haven't they? And that's the issue, that relationally, how much time do we have? Socially, I think we're more isolated. I mean, we could get onto a whole new podcast here, but you're in Tesco's and Sainsbury's, it's self-service checkouts. You look at commuters sitting there, we're not as good as we used to be at reaching out, socially speaking. And there's a lot of research, as we all know, about the importance of quality connections. But what there's also research about is the importance of just these small everyday connections with people, how important that is for mental health, mental well-being, and developing sort of social connections. And yet we miss out on that so often. There was some research in 2014 in Chicago where commuters had to talk to someone that they didn't know. And then the other set of commuters could just do what they always did and sit there with a book and sit there stony face and ignore everyone. And they found that those that had to talk to someone were really scared about it. They didn't want to do it. What if the other person's not interested? But they found that after they talked to someone, they felt so much better about their day. And then that feeling of feeling better lasted a long time through that day. But we miss out on so much of stuff because we're on our phones. It's all web chat. So I think there's so much to this in developing better social connections and being relational and valuing the time input into relationships rather than just work and getting on.
That's what a great conclusion. It's all about valuing the human side of us in relationships, really, isn't it? It comes down to that in the end. This and many other factors that influence how people feel and their
Cool.
well-being. Thank you so much, Andrew. Before you go, doesn't have to be related to imposter syndrome, but what's your kind of top book recommendation?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm often asked this, and for me, hands down, and it could just be the style of the writing and how that applies to me, but the two books by Matthew Syed, Black Box Thinking and Rebel Ideas, they're very different books. Yep. One is not a rehash of the other, and there's so much in that in terms of leadership. Some of it covers some of the areas that we talked about. I also think if you're not up for books but you like your Audible stuff, Darren Brown's Boot Camp for the Brain is quite a good Audible series to get hold of. 6-part series. There's a lot of value in that if you want to make better decisions in terms of self-awareness, in terms of biases and things like that. It's really entertaining, as you can imagine it would be with Darren Brown, but there's a really rich insight within those 6. So for me, Audible series, Boot Camp for the Brain by Darren Brown, I'd recommend. And the 2 books by Matthew Syed, they are my absolute, they're in my bookshelf. I can see them from over here. They're really, really good books.
Fantastic, Andy. Thank you so much for joining. There's loads of stuff that you've mentioned. So I implore anyone that's listening to this to take action, whether it's improving psychological safety, checking the biases that you've got, using some of the tools that Andrew's provided, or indeed if people want to reach out for you to learn more or get to come and speak.
Yeah, please. I know, I'd love to. So I'm really easy to find on LinkedIn because my surname, as you can see, is Payne. My initial is A. You'd have thought my parents would have thought about that, really. But it makes me very easy to find on social media. So LinkedIn, do connect with me. And then if you were thinking, wow, we've got a team away day, we've got a company conference, what would Andrew be like as a speaker? What would he speak about? Let's have a conversation with him. Then just connect with me via my website, www.andrewpayne.co.uk, and it'd be great to chat.
Excellent. Thank you very much. This has been Team Talk with Andrew Payne. Thank you very much for joining us. Cheers.